Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Outside Looking In, the podcast series wherein I talk to somebody from every single market in the league, 29 episodes, to get what their idea of the Raptors is so we can form some sort of consensus, but also so you, the listener, the viewer, whichever it is, YouTube, podcast channel, you get to understand the lens viewed 29 teams. And so hopefully you become one of the most well-rounded fans in the world. That's the goal here for you to know so much. And the Nets, man, an endlessly interesting team. There's a lot up in the air, even though things have settled down. And to discuss that with me is Matt Brooks of Nets Daily and Basketball News. And so let's how are you doing? First of all, you doing
I'm
good?
I'm okay. Yeah, I'm hanging in there. It was a busy summer. What an off season. I not used to having stuff to do. I guess news related all the way through like August. But yeah, very interesting off season. Probably a good way to start.
Well, your voice has been heard around the world consulting on this net stuff, all the way from Canada to Australia, and
Yeah.
and now finally culminating in this podcast. And that's where we'll start. What the hell is going on in Brooklyn? I mean, things have settled somewhat, but yeah, can you clue me in?
Yeah, I guess Durant's back. It's sort of the team is kind of all getting together. They have training camp that starts in 2 weeks. But there's already guys kind of working out at the facility here in Brooklyn. So Kyrie's, I think, just come back probably a couple days ago. Durant's supposed to be joining them. Which is I think a little weird. He's like the last one. Which makes sense, I guess, in a way that he's kind of the straggler. So technically, everybody's getting together. It's all kumbaya right now. I'm sure we're gonna have training camp, and there's gonna be a bunch of quotes about how locked in everybody is because that's what training camp is. Is it's just PR for the team basically. So we probably won't really know what this whole situation looks like until we get into the first string or so of games where the Nets actually are playing like a lot of really good teams, the Bucks, the Grizzlies. That I think is where we're really going to learn like how stable this whole situation is.
So the Kyrie stuff, were you leaning any type of way? Were you, as somebody who covers the team, just kind of like, you know what, move on? It's what put on the GM hat, and you're like, what would I do? Would I just cut and run? Would I just say, okay, we're gonna try and get picks, we're gonna try and make it move, and we're gonna try and build something new with Ben Simmons and whoever else is around, Royce O'Neal, which the trade was like a super meme, but then I guess it's a good trade now
Yeah.
because Royce is a good player, and it was funny that they trade for him when they were supposedly blowing everything up. But now it makes sense.
Yeah, it's probably a sign of where the front office was kind of leaning the whole time, was that they wanted to ultimately get everybody back at least for one more year, which we'll see. Everybody's calling. I love that Nets fans are calling it like the last dance, and I'm like, there weren't any first dances. Like this is just the dance. But no, I mean, yeah, I think the smartest thing, and kind of what I said all throughout, was the smartest thing to do, even though there are difficulties, I think, with just some of the things that have happened with Kyrie over the last couple of years. But the best thing you can do is keep him on the roster because ultimately he's your tie to Durant, and Durant's the best possible player that you can have if you're trying to remain competitive in the interim. And I think that's what the Nets want to do the whole time, was just be as good as possible. So yeah, I think in that way, keeping Kyrie was the right move. Just because again, that's your best chance to win anything.
So I think the optimist viewpoint is that you would describe Kyrie as mercurial,
Hmm.
and that's like kind of it. It ties up all of the things about him. He's a mercurial figure. KD, even he is to some degree. I'm curious because the Nets had always seemed like an exercise in talent in the NBA. And you look at teams like the Grizzlies, who sure they had failings in the playoffs, but this is a team who was massively successful because they had talent, but because they had good vibes and continuity, and they had a very they chiseled out a play style that made sense for them. The Nets have been in and out of everything. They had Harden, they had Kyrie, they had Durant. I think it was they only played 700 possessions together or something like that. And they won a lot of games when they did play together. It was tough to beat those guys, but everything fell to the wayside. I'm curious that I know you said you have to wait to see like Bucks and games against the other contenders, but I really am curious with Ben Simmons on the roster, with KD, with Kyrie. Do you expect full seasons from these guys? Do you expect contender status?
That would be ideal, right? Like if you're because if it doesn't go that way, if somebody gets hurt early or whatever, or they start off slow, I think the noise about firing Nash gets pretty loud. I think you have to address. I mean, at some point, if things get bad and this team is 500 or something like that, I bet you the noise about Durant gets pretty loud, and that starts to become a topic at the deadline. So yeah, I mean, if everything clicks, which it never does for the Nets, this is a contender. Like this is a team that I really truly believe can come out of the East. A lot of moving pieces, figuring out how to use Ben Simmons, I think is going to be a big task. I think, as everybody knows, this like the potential is absolutely there. This is a really good core for him, but it's still going to be an acclimation period. So in the meantime, you just have to hope that things just go well for this team because they will in spots, but there's always going to be that hamstring strain or ankle roll that's going to derail this team at like the worst possible time.
When I think of this team, the platonic ideal of the Nets, that's a contender. Not only is it that they have Simmons and Kyrie and KD, but they have like Seth Curry, they have Claxton, they have lots of Royce O'Neal, they have lots of interesting players on the team outside
Joe
of that.
Harris. Yep.
Joe Harris, yeah.
Yep.
Like handsome bearded guy in Brooklyn, Joe Harris and Matt Brooks, right? That's kind of like the deal. I hope you have a good jump shot as well.
I
But
don't. It's terrible.
but it's a good team. Now they have to be able to kind of coalesce together, and that should be really interesting. You said you're a fan of bouncing around. I'm not sure if you saw this episode, but I was talking about the Nets, and I was like, man, I just have to be able to see Harden and Kyrie and Durant play together. And I didn't get that opportunity. Hardly anybody did. And yeah, I'm very curious about that team. Who knows what the hell is going to happen? But
Yeah.
the Raptors are intertwined in this. And from my point of view, I talked about this a couple times, and it was like, I don't think the Raptors get Durant. I think that the Raptors were involved in the Durant speculation because the Raptors are perceived to be, one, a star away from contention, and two, one of the teams that could trade out players and still maintain that contender status. And so it was like they fit the terms of being in that trade, but KD obviously, I don't think he wanted to go to Toronto. I'm curious when you were, from your point of view, because I do this thing when OG was in trade rumors, and I thought like, who would I want from Portland? You know, Dame says that OG and Mikal Bridges are the two guys he wants to play with, and Portland tried to get OG, and it's like, well, who would I want? You know, Josh Hart, a pick, and maybe another pick, something like that. When the Raptors were involved in the rumors, who were you trying to pluck away for KD? Was there a trade package that you wanted?
I mean, Scottie and OG would probably be a good start. I mean, I know the team is like really, or the Nets are really high on Scottie, and like they should be. I mean, I know Raptors fans love Scottie, so that was kind of the basics of it. I thought that was actually a really intriguing package. I think you could make a case that depending on where the Nets wanted to go, that was really one of the best offers they could get. Although it kind of seemed like they wanted more win now pieces. So, in the end, I think that Jaylen Brown package was probably the closest to what they were looking for, at least from a front office perspective. But no, I mean, just the Scottie and OG is like a great, great starting point. And, I think if the Nets had been more serious about actually trading Durant and that had gotten there from both sides, I do think there was a world where that could have happened. But I just don't think the Nets ever wanted to trade Durant. Honestly.
Who would want to trade Durant, right? He's incredible. I bet like I really do feel, not that I'm in the business of feeling for front offices too often, honestly, but I do feel for the Nets and the decision makers. They've been in a pickle for some time, and everybody knew that there were some questions about taking on more like controversial figures for locker room stuff, but it seemed like everything hit fever pitch repeatedly. It wasn't, they couldn't just have like a nice 3-week stint or anything like that. It was always at 100 from go. The thing I want to ask you about next, though, is the Raptors. They didn't make the trade. Scottie, you love Scottie. Everybody loves Scottie. Scottie plus Pascal plus OG, Fred. Gary, Precious, all the regulars. A team remains. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the Toronto Raptors.
Good team. Will be really frisky. Depends on who they put. Like if they play the Nets and the Nets are dysfunctional, and those teams meet up in the playoffs, I could see them really causing problems for the Nets. And that's a lot of that just depends on how things go this year over here, which that's always I feel like how I come into Nets seasons is just with like a shrug and being like, all right, we're gonna do this again. I like the Raptors. I think they're probably on the lower end, like a 6 seed for me. Which I know some Raptors fans are really high on the team this year. I'm probably closer to that. I just think the top end of the conference, maybe a 5 seed, is really, really strong. I do think there's an interesting conversation to be had between them and the Cavs about which of those two teams is going to finish higher in the standings. And that's probably what you're looking at in terms of tiering these teams out, if we're going to look at it that way.
I'm gonna have the Cavs conversation with Bowser to Bowser, who does
Oh,
the
fun.
basketball action dictionary. And I
So
think,
good.
yeah, we're gonna have a really good conversation about that. The Cavs opening night, Cavs versus Raptors should rock. That
Yes.
should be a really, really great matchup. And the Nets matchup with the Raptors, that's also a curious one because Kyrie probably that's like his series because KD will get the kitchen sink thrown at him because the Raptors are more well equipped to kind of dig in on KD. As we saw what happened with KD last playoffs, and the Raptors have similar strengths to Boston in that regard. That doesn't mean you clamp KD. I mean, nobody
Yeah.
does. It's just maybe you can limit some of those big scoring bursts. And Kyrie, Fred has to get through another season healthy. All that stuff has to pop off. It would be really interesting to see how the Raptors try and guard Kyrie for a
Mhm.
series. Because if Kyrie is going, Fred is a great answer, quite frankly, but there's no great answer if Kyrie has it going. And Gary Trent Jr., if they try and
Let's
get
bring
away
him
with
up.
that, it's death for them. That's really
Yeah.
bad news. And so it would be really interesting to see how. Oh shit! Headphone popped up. It would be really interesting to see how the Raptors deal with not only attacking the offensive glass as they often do, but also how they approach it defensively because the Nets will get into the middle of the defense and the Raptors will have to pull off the strong side corner and the weak side corner. And it will be rotation. And seeing guys like Joe Harris spot up, the Raptors, they played the Nets in a playoff series a couple of years ago, and Joe Harris was the best player on the Nets halfway through that series before he got injured, hitting shots. And so, yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about it from that point of view. Is like, man, I haven't done the playoff matchup thing. I think we're going to do it on the Cavs series, but this is the first time in the podcast, the outside looking in series, that we considered like, hey, what happens in this series? And Raptors
Yeah.
versus Nets would be absolutely awesome. And to your point about the Raptors being like a 6 seed, the first episode I did this series, I said I could see I don't think the Bulls will be better than the Raptors, but I could see a version of the Bulls if they have everybody healthy. Like that
Yeah.
that team could be really great. The Cavs could be really great. The Raptors could be really great. The middle of the Eastern Conference is really competitive, and the Raptors could by all means improve by significant measures and still end up with worse seeding than they did last year. That's just how this is going to shake out. So 6 seed I don't think is a slight at all. It just speaks to, as you said, the strength of the conference. And the Eastern Conference has low key been kind of awesome for a really, really long time. Scottie Barnes, by the way, just I'm curious on your flashbulb thoughts. Everybody loves Scottie Barnes. They have a platform to speak about it here, and because Raptors fans, what do they want to hear? People gush about Scottie Barnes, so the opportunity is now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else there is to say. Two-way player. I don't know if I'm going to break any news. I like that it looks like he's bulked up this offseason. Um, and there's just something about, there's just something about him. Like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like the level of, um, feel, I guess, that he has already that just sticks out. I mean, he had a couple huge performances against the Nets last year where it's like this guy just kind of knew exactly the weaknesses of this Nets team in terms of attacking the glass, and just generally like getting into the paint. That I just was unique to watch, and the way he kind of went head to head with Durant in a way I thought was also like really different. It just was not. I don't know. I just hadn't seen somebody kind of approach playing the Nets like that and Durant like that I don't know. I don't know how to. I'm not gonna give you a ton of like good analysis outside of like he just has it. Like he's got that dog in him.
That's I think that's a common takeaway for Scottie, and I
Yeah,
think it makes sense because I talked about this with Lero. Is that dogging him is kind of like funny as far as analysis, but it does harken to something that is true.
yeah,
Some guys do have it, and you can't quantify it, but more or less you know it when you see it. I think some people overvalue the itness, or maybe they like the halo effect, right? Where it's like they see it once and that means they continue to look for it always.
yeah,
And yeah, Scotty though, that game against the Nets where like he was like stop and pop in mid range
yeah,
against KD, guarded him on the other end, and KD is winning that defensive matchup a lot of the time, honestly. But it's interesting to see that Scotty's a guy who's going to go after it, and he's going to try and he's going to get after dudes defensively. His, his foot speed and all that kind of stuff. I'm curious where it ends up, during his prime as far as a defensive stopper. But yeah, there's tons of potential on that end as well. Ben Simmons is another guy who
mm.
succeeds with, two-way play, limited jump shot. Although Scotty obviously has,
He
it
takes
took
him.
him like it took like 4 games for him to be better at shooting threes than Ben Simmons. But as far as these big, like extremely strong, wonderful in the open court creators, I think that Scotty and Ben have something. There's a comparison to be made, at least for some parts of their game. But Ben Simmons, you have not seen him play for the Nets yet, but he is a Net, and we haven't seen him play in a long time. I'm curious what you think about Ben Simmons for this upcoming season, because he's like at his best an all NBA level player,
Yeah,
which is a hell of a thing.
yeah, for sure. I mean, they got rid of an all NBA level player and brought one in, and a guy that I think is fair to say is on the decline. And they got somebody who's going to help them a lot. I'm curious about how they utilize him. Is he going to be a point of attack guy? Are they going to play him at center? They switch so much that ultimately he'll be guarding lead creators a lot. So I don't know if that matters as much, but this roster is like perfect for him offensively in terms of how much shooting they have. I put up a stat on my Twitter, just kind of like detailing everybody's corner 3-point percentage on this roster. And it's like, it's perfect for a guy in Simmons, who I think, what did he lead in most corner 3-point shots created? Am I right about that? That sounds like a stat that's been thrown around a lot. So, yeah, so I think I'm really curious about that. How he's utilized in the half court is fascinating. I know the team envisioned him as like a post up hub when they brought him in, which I thought was really interesting. I kind of envisioned him as, especially if they're going to play him alongside Claxton, as kind of like a short roller. You can kind of get like a Lob City connection there if possible. That'll be really fascinating for me, is how they use him in the half court, especially in those 8 to 10 minutes where he's sharing the floor with Claxton. That'll be the biggest utilization. But outside of that, I mean, there's so much you can do with him as a handoff threat. I was just talking to somebody a couple minutes ago. You could use him in pistol and kind of fake dribble handoffs that way. There's just a lot of really cool ways to utilize him, and it's a really good roster for him, at least, to fully maximize what he can be. It's just a matter of, can he stay on the floor? Are these back issues something that are going to linger, or is this something that he's taken care of early? And then just how does he gel with the team? Because he is somebody that I think, I don't want to get into like too much of the whatever. I think we can kind of guess what I'm talking about. I don't want to get into too much stuff that is not really my business to get into, but it's just a matter of like, is this roster going to gel just cohesively and collectively? And how does that play a part on Ben? Like, how does he feel a part of this team?
That's the interesting aspect, is because we haven't seen Ben play in such a long time that if you had taken Ben's best stretch and he had just come off that stretch of play, and you told him now that, like, hey, you're playing with Joe Harris and Kyrie and Katie, everyone would be like, oh my God, Ben is going to be an incredible weapon. Because as you said, like, Ben, Joel Embiid is the much better player. So I understand why they didn't tailor the roster to Simmons in Philly. But Simmons, admittedly, was a little bit hampered by Joel's presence. And Joel was
Yep.
hampered by Simmons a little bit too. So Simmons is in the ideal spot to weaponize things that he wasn't really able to. Like there are wrinkles of his game that, Giannis Antetokounmpo should be like the best roller in the NBA, but he isn't. And so Ben, it doesn't mean that Ben is automatically going to be a short roller because his skills say that he should be an incredible short
Yeah.
roller, but maybe he will be.
Yeah.
And we'll get to see. Basically, it's an opportunity to see how Ben operates in what seems like his ideal situation. So it's a very he's probably I think he's probably a massive part of their regular season, honestly. If he gets it going, if he gets to do all his grab and go stuff, if he gets to be very active as an off-ball cutter and a guy who works as like a wheel greaser offensively in the half court, I think that he could have just obviously his best season so far. And that's probably not something that's being discussed a lot because it's so much of what Ben Simmons has been talked about lately is just clouded in other things.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's probably the most interesting aspect of the Nets is because Kyrie and KD are proven quantities. We know what's going on with those
Yeah.
dudes. They just have to be on the court. And, Kyrie, even when things are as crazy as possible off the court, he can still step on the court and be incredible. Like it doesn't seem to really affect him. KD, it's the same thing. Ben Simmons is the guy who we have to see if he can just kind of step back onto the court and be everything that he was, that his game says he should be. That's interesting. And also, man, I really do wonder how that's gonna shake out. That's probably the most interesting question about it, outside of just like, "Hey, does this team hate each other?
Yeah.
Are these guys friends at all?" Like, not that you have to be good friends, but just, are these guys gonna be, like, hating each other all season is probably the second or first most, interesting thing.
Yeah, which also like plays into Simmons because I feel like if it's that situation, he's kind of gonna pull back a little bit. I
Mhm.
just that's the sense I've gotten is that there's
Mhm.
just a lot that's happened in his career. So for him to be in a situation that's unstable is like I just don't want that for him. I want Ben Simmons to be really good. Like I want this to be I want this to be a good year for him. That story is inspiring if he's able to like have a career year, and I think there's just real opportunity for all the reasons that we mentioned.
So, last thing I'm going to ask you is the Raptors and Nets play very different styles, offensively and defensively. And I'm curious, is there anything if you could steal from the Nets to the Raptors or the Raptors to the Nets, what would it be?
Ooh, oh man. Wow, this is a good question. Is this I don't know. Man, I mean, maybe just attacking the offensive glass more. Although I don't know if the Nets have the horses to do that. I mean, in a way, it's like they have kind of I mean, they've literally like grown in size this offseason, so that's helped. Last year they had, these lineups where they're running out Goran Dragic and Seth Curry and I don't Patty Mills like in the playoff
Mhm.
site. I think that would be the ideal way is literally to just increase the average size of the Nets when they're on the floor, which I think they've done in a way. But stylistically, that's a really good question. Um, I'm gonna throw that back to you. What would your answer be on that?
Well, with the offensive rebounding thing first, the Raptors, they're at an interesting point where we have to see these players go on to another scheme because the Raptors, they drafted Delano Banton, Scottie Barnes, and then had an undrafted free agent, Justin Champagnie. And all those guys were above the 90th percentile
Mm,
in offensive rebounding for their position, for their grouping, like forward or guard or combo per cleaning the glass. And you wonder, like, did the Raptors properly identify all the best offensive rebounders in the
mm,
class, or are they playing a style where offensive rebounding is more so a play style rather than it is a talent? Like, can you just force offensive rebounding? The Raptors are a
yeah,
small team, but Scottie Barnes, Precious Achua, Chris Boucher, like all these guys who aren't the biggest they're bigger than the other wings, but they're not bigger than the other bigs. These guys get after it on the glass, and Memphis also does that to some degree as well. Although Steven Adams is like obviously a huge part of things happening with that. So that's really interesting. And then play style, I think that seeing KD and Kyrie get screen help is something because there's this platonic ideal of, okay, go get me a bucket. And nobody's better at that really than Katie and Kyrie. Like that is the wonderful thing about those guys. And somehow Pascal Siakam led the NBA in isolations. Why would that, like, Pascal is great. He's all NBA. I think that his isolations are fruitful more often than not. But why wouldn't you let that guy play with screens? And I think that Steve Nash, the offense is definitely, it's not as reliant on isolation as people thought it might be. Because they can always go to that in like the second half of the shot clock, but they have tons of like early actions and stuff like that that the Raptors oftentimes do not. And I think that Nick Nurse probably is leaving a lot of food on the table as far as offensive decision making and offensive spacing by virtue of how you set up your offense. Because a lot of the
Yeah.
time, the Raptors are very rote and uninventive in how they kind of set up their set actions. So the Nets at their peak, of course, benefit from it being Katie and Kyrie, but also there's just some really great stuff in there that the Raptors might be able to pull from as far as getting guys, screening actions in the flow, making decisions going downhill, having shooters lift when they're supposed to rather than just standing still. There's a cohesion to the Nets offensively, a fluidity that the Raptors, I wish they could emulate. I don't know if they have the talent to do it, but I wish that they could.
Yeah, and I think that fluidity kind of went away a little bit in the Celtics series. Like there was just a lot more stagnation for the Nets. So I think like even just I'd have to watch more Raptors film honestly, but like even just when I looked at kind of Durant's struggles, was like I just felt like they didn't diversify his touches as much. So if there's a diversification that the Raptors are doing, then there's a way to do that. I'm going to touch on the rebounding thing. The Nets were that fun team where they didn't get back in transition defensively and they didn't rebound. So I think that's the big thing. It's like, please do one or the other.
Mhm.
So that's the big thing that kind of stuck out to me all year for the Nets.
That's something I talked about with Caitlin Cooper because
Okay.
she was really interested because the Raptors. So a niche understanding of the Raptors is that when you watch them, you'll notice that a lot of times there'll be four guys below the free throw line.
Mhm.
This is demonic. This is like anti-spacing as hell, and this is why Pascal Siakam, his talent to navigate tight spaces, and Scottie Barnes continuing to learn that fits really well with the Raptors. But it's difficult because there's so many defenders in the paint because the Raptors were like, hey, nobody's gonna guard Thad Young above the break. If he's not the guy in the corner, just go see if you can rebound. The same
Yeah.
thing, Precious Achua, his shooting came along really great at the end of the year. So who knows how it works next year? But they basically Justin Champagnie, Scottie Barnes,
Yeah.
Precious Achua, Boucher, they're like, don't worry about spacing because they don't want to guard you. And just see if you can go grab an offensive rebound, which is kind of insane. And the other insane aspect of it is that teams didn't run out on the Raptors. Of course, Philly did achieve that to some degree against them in the playoffs because Embiid was able to do a lot of the heavy lifting with rebounding. But typically, the Raptors are able to impose their will by bringing guys care about the Raptors' offensive
Yeah.
rebound. So they come down with the Raptors. They don't leak out. And so the Raptors are able to imprint the game that way. We've yet to see if it really changes the game, if that's something that they can carry over into the playoffs and you impose your will that way. But during the regular season, they limit transition despite throwing everybody at the
Yeah.
offensive glass. It's very unique.
Yeah, I think, and actually, this is kind of how I took this question when I saw it originally. Was I almost wish these? It's not even a stylistic thing. I just wish these two teams could like exchange a couple players, where it's like, here's a Seth Curry. We're gonna give you a wing back, like because the Nets have, they got Curry and Mills and Harris, which is like an insane shooting trio. But could you probably live without one of them? Maybe. I kind of was under. I at least in my mind, I thought they were gonna move off of one of those guys with Seth kind of being the guy that I thought was going to be the odd man out. So it's more of like, I don't even know if it's a stylistic thing. It's more of like, I just wish there was a way for these two teams to be like, here's, X role guy for Seth Curry. Let's exchange these two guys. All of a sudden, the Nets have a wing and then, the Raptors have this elite movement shooter that can create for himself if he's run off the line, into a 1-2 dribble pull up. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I don't even know if it's a stylistic thing. It's just literally like, I feel like even before these two teams got into conversations about Durant, there's something to be had here between these two in terms of exchanging whoever on the roster.
That's definitely that happens in some franchises in basketball that they have a history of trading with each other.
Yeah.
And it's because, front office pals. more
Yep.
than likely. But baseball is way more into that. Like in baseball, the Blue Jays, for example, they love Dodgers pitchers. And so they will trade for Dodgers pitchers because they're like, yeah, we like what you do, we like how you develop them, and we think they'll fit good here. And I wonder, as the NBA, whatever it looks like in 30 years, because the talent pool is
Oh my
so
god.
deep. I wonder if there's expansion, and I wonder if, rosters expand. I wonder if there's like a more meaningful minor league type thing, and
Yeah.
that teams start to do that. Like, okay, we like what you do. We'll do the trade with you. Yeah, like because obviously the Nets and the Raptors are in the same division. They're not going to do like, hey, friendly. I think we can both win here. It's just not. They're going to try
Yeah.
and rip each other's eyes out while they
Yeah.
trade. The Masai Ujiri Classic, obviously.
Especially with Marks too. Like Marks does not like to take L's. So
Yeah.
so
That's a very good trait for a general manager or a
yeah.
president. Like,
Yeah.
"Hey, I'm gonna make the good decisions."
Yep.
Even though things have gone sideways, I don't think any bad decision making was made on the Nets' behalf. I think it's just, like, everything went sideways in the worst possible way, and, like, James Harden was incredible and
Yep.
is still facing like, he against the Raptors in the playoffs, was still facing that hamstring stuff.
Yep.
So, man, the Nets, the decision making, I think, was great. I didn't think it was hubris. I didn't think it was anything. I think they made the right decisions. Just you can't win them all sometimes, man. It's
Well, they
crazy.
won the standoff. Like I could not believe they won the standoff this offseason. I truly thought Durant was gone. So to win that standoff was wild.
It's tough to win a standoff against a
Oh yeah.
superstar. It does not. Ben Simmons won his. James Harden won his.
Yep.
Anthony Davis won his. Like superstars, like, player empowerment isn't player empowerment. It's superstar empowerment for the most
Yep.
part. And like the role players do get kind of disaffected because they get shipped off everywhere when, superstars like, hey, I don't like it so much here.
Yeah, right,
Get me out of here.
right.
And so, but that's their prerogative. They do as they wish. They have the leverage to bargain that kind of stuff. And KD not being able to bargain his way out of Brooklyn is pretty crazy. And they could still win a championship. Like it's one of those things, right? Kawhi, Raptors fans will remember Kawhi. The initial
Yep.
report was like, he's not coming to camp. He does not want to play with the Raptors. And then he got a Finals MVP and scored like 35 a game against the 76ers. Just if it's a talented guy, you just try and make it work, man.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
yeah, I'm excited to see if the Nets are able to make it work in this season. But I think that's a decent place to end the podcast. But more than anything, it's an opportunity for you now to plug yourself, to let the
Okay.
people know where to find you, and if you have anything coming up that's interesting, if there's something you want them to read, to keep up, whatever.
Yeah, you can follow me, Matt Brooks NBA on Twitter. That's kind of where everything goes. I just literally like before I got on this show, I put out a video on TJ Warren, which I'm excited about. Just kind of like talking about what he brings to the table. Want to do something on Royce O'Neal before training camp. We'll see if I get it done. But yeah, this off season's fun for me. I do a bunch of like little, kind of amateur scouting projects, taking a stab at what I can gather from watching however many games. And that's kind of what I'm doing right now. And then once the season starts, we'll be back to regular reporting, back to the grind. So it's an exciting time of year. I'm really excited for the season.
Yeah, man. I'm looking forward to your coverage of it
Thank
because
you.
that team is going to be very interesting. And yeah, it's always good to for Raptors fans, whoever's listening to this, just make sure you tune in with Matt because the Brooklyn is going to be one of the most interesting teams this year. And it's always good to just know somebody who's going to hold it down in a market. Matt should be your guy in Brooklyn. But
Thank you.
Matt, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it.
And listener, viewer, whichever it is, if you're viewing on YouTube, make sure to like the video because that helps. I think the algorithm, something like that. I'm not a YouTubist or a YouTuber, but I hear it's good. And podcast channel people, just keep on rocking, do your thing. We're out of here. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you.